there is a forgotten skull from the center of India that sits in one of the most important places on Earth, not just geographically, but biologically, as if it was dropped into the exact corridor where three ancient human worlds were forced to touch. To the west and north stretched the cold-adapted range of the Neanderthals, from Europe through the Caucasus, Iran, Central Asia, and according to habitat modeling, northern India. To the east and south stretched the shadowy domain of the Denisovans, not one tribe, not one cave lineage, not one Siberian side branch, but a deep Asian human presence whose DNA still echoes most strongly far to the south, in island Southeast Asia, New Guinea and Oceania. Between those worlds stood India, not as an empty bridge, not as a passive route for travellers moving from Africa into Australia, but as a vast ecological stage of monsoon forests, river valleys, dry plains, basalt uplands, and changing grasslands where ancient humans met, mixed, competed, vanished and endured. And in the middle of that stage, from the Narmada Valley, came a skull that has never fit neatly into the boxes built for it, dating to around 200 to 400,000 years ago. The Narmada skull is usually introduced in cautious language, as if it is simply a Middle Pleistocene human fossil from India, as if that phrase settles anything. It was found near Hathnora, on the banks of the Narmada River, in a landscape cut through by water, gravel, ancient flood deposits and stone tools. But the skull itself is not a minor curiosity. It is a partial cranium, thick, powerful, broad and archaic, with a low vault, heavy brow region, and a combination of traits that refuses to sit comfortably inside one familiar category. It has often been linked to Homo heidelbergensis, to archaic Homo sapiens, or to late Homo erectus forms in Asia, depending on which comparison an author preferred and which evolutionary map they started with. But the fossil has always had a more unsettling implication. India was not simply a migration corridor. It was an overlap zone. It sat between the Western Neanderthal world and the Denisovan world, and the Narmada skull looks exactly like the kind of fossil that should come out of such a place. The most important clue is not only where Narmada was found, but what it resembles. When viewed beside the Ngandong skulls, the so-called solo man from Java, the resemblance becomes difficult to ignore. Ngandong is one of the great puzzles of Asian human history, late-surviving, large-brained, archaic humans from Java, with long, low cranial vaults, strong brow structures, thick bones, and a form that seems too advanced for simple old-style Homo erectus, yet too archaic to become comfortably modern. Forever they have been treated as late Homo erectus, a kind of evolutionary dead end in Indonesia. But once Denisovan DNA was discovered in Siberia, and then found in its strongest living inheritance among Papuans and people of island Southeast Asia, the map changed. Suddenly, the missing fossils of the southern Denisovans had to be somewhere. The DNA said they existed. The geography said they were widespread. The fossil record, scattered and poorly sampled across tropical Asia, offered several candidates. Ngandong became one of the most compelling. If Ngandong represents a southern Denisovan form, then Narmada takes on a completely different meaning. It is not simply an Indian oddity. It becomes a northern or western edge of that same broad southern Denisovan world, a form related not to the cold Siberian Denisovans from the Altai Mountains, but to a warmer, more tropical Asian lineage that stretched from India towards Southeast Asia. The distinction is crucial. The Denisovan tooth and finger bone from Denisova Cave came from a northern environment, a cold-adapted world where Denisovans, Neanderthals and later Homo sapiens all passed through the same cave system. But the DNA carried by Papuans and other Southeast Asian people points to Denisovan ancestry far deeper and more complex than a single cave in Siberia. The strongest Denisovan ancestry today is not in Siberia, it is far to the south. That means the most important Denisovan people were not simply the Altai Denisovans. They were southern Denisovans, adapted to tropical Asia, island chains, monsoon forests, river systems and warm coastal corridors. This is where Narmada becomes so explosive. The skull does not have to match the Altai Denisovan because the Altai fossil sample is tiny and geographically northern. It has to match the southern Denisovan pattern. And that is exactly where Ngandong enters the story. The Narmada skull and the Ngandong crania share the impression of heavy archaic power combined with substantial brain capacity. They do not look like small-brained, primitive leftovers frozen in time. They look like regional Asian humans with deep roots, large skulls, thick bones, and a long evolutionary history outside the neat African replacement model. The skull from India sits west of Java and southeast of the Neanderthal frontier, precisely where a southern Denisovan lineage would have met western archaic humans moving along the Iranian plateau, the Himalayan foothills, and the river corridors of northern India. The usual mental map places Neanderthals in Europe and Denisovans in Asia, but the real map is messier and far more interesting. Neanderthals were not trapped in France and Germany. Their bones and DNA placed them across western Eurasia, through the Caucasus, into the Altai, and likely across parts of Central Asia. The eastern Neanderthal frontier was not a wall, it was a broad contact belt. If Neanderthals reached the Altai, then their ecological and biological range already extended deep into Asia. From that fact alone, it becomes far easier to imagine Neanderthal-related people along the northern route into India, especially through Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Indus region, and the Himalayan-adjacent corridors. Northern India was not beyond reach. It was one of the natural edges of the Neanderthal world. That matters because one of the deepest puzzles in human DNA has always been the timing and location of Neanderthal mixture in the ancestors of people today. The standard dogma often places that meeting somewhere in the Levant or Western Asia after Homo sapiens. But that answer has never felt complete. The Neanderthal DNA in living people outside Africa is widespread, shared and old, but the world where this mixture happened had to be large enough, populated enough, and connected enough to affect nearly every non-African lineage. A tiny encounter in one cave or one narrow corridor struggles to carry that burden. A larger contact zone stretching from the Near East across Iran, Central Asia and northern India solves far more. It creates a long frontier where modern humans, Neanderthal-related groups, and Denisovan-related groups were all within reach of one another, sometimes directly, sometimes through neighbouring communities, sometimes across generations of movement. India sits at the heart of that solution. For people moving east, India was unavoidable. The northern route led through Iran and into the Indus and Ganges worlds. The southern route followed coastlines and monsoon belts. The interior routes moved along rivers and uplands. Every major path between Western Eurasia and Southeast Asia had to contend with the Indian subcontinent. If Neanderthal-related ancestry entered expanding Homo sapiens groups in Western Asia and northern India, and Denisovan ancestry entered those same or related groups farther east and south, then India becomes the hinge between the two great archaic inheritances in people today. It is not the edge of the story. It is the joint. The Narmada skull is powerful because it gives a face, however incomplete, to that missing zone. It belongs to a time when the boundaries between named human groups were not the clean borders drawn in textbooks. A skull from India with archaic Asian affinities, resembling the solo forms more than a classic European Neanderthal, is exactly what should exist if southern Denisovans occupied a broad belt from India toward Indonesia. At the same time, northern India lay within reach of Neanderthal-related people from the west and northwest. That means the Narmada world was not isolated. It sat between lineages. It sat where ancestry could cross. It sat where bodies, tools and landscapes combined in ways that later categories struggle to capture. Think about the ecology of India during the late Middle Pleistocene and into the early Late Pleistocene. This was not a uniform tropical paradise. Climate shifted sharply with monsoon strength, glacial cycles, river incision, lake levels, grassland expansion and forest retreat. In cooler and drier phases, corridors opened across northwest India and Pakistan, tying the subcontinent to Iran and Central Asia. In wetter phases, monsoon forests and river systems expanded, tying India more strongly to Southeast Asia. That alternating rhythm created a biological pump. Western archaic humans entered during one ecological phase. Southern Asian humans expanded during another. Homo sapiens groups later moved into landscapes already occupied by deep local lineages. Every shift brought contact, friction, replacement, absorption and survival. The Narmada fossil, then, is not just a skull. It is a warning against a flattened map. The old story often treated South Asia as a route taken by Homo sapiens on the way to Australia, as if ancient India was simply crossed rather than inhabited. But India had its own deep human history, long before those later expansions. Stone tools were there, river valleys were occupied, large mammals were hunted or scavenged, ancient people adapted to changing climates over immense spans of time. A skull like Narmada proves that the subcontinent contained powerful archaic humans of its own, and their identity matters because their location matches the predicted overlap between the Neanderthal sphere and the southern Denisovan sphere. The comparison with Ngandong also changes how we think about Denisovans themselves. The word Denisovan often creates the wrong picture, a mysterious Siberian cave people known from DNA, a tooth and fragments. But that is only the discovery point, not the full homeland. The southern Denisovans were almost certainly diverse, regional and long established. The people who contributed DNA to Papuans and other groups were deeply split from the Altai-Denisovan line. That means Denisovan is not a single look, a single body plan, or a single cave ancestry. It is a wide Asian branch comparable in scale to the Neanderthal branch with northern and southern forms. The Altai form represents one point in that world. Ngandong, Narmada, and perhaps other Asian fossils represent another face of it. This southern Denisovan idea also explains why the fossil picture has seemed so confusing. If researchers keep searching for an Altai-like Denisovan skeleton in India or Java, they are chasing the wrong ghost. The southern Denisovan body was shaped by a different environment and a different history. It lived under monsoon skies, along tropical rivers, in warm forests and open plains, near coastlines and volcanic islands. Its skull form would not need to mirror a northern cave lineage. It would carry older Asian traits, thick cranial walls, broad faces, strong brow structures, and large brains shaped by long regional continuity. That is why the Ngandong connection matters so much. It gives southern Denisovans a plausible anatomy, and Narmada fits into that anatomical corridor. The phrase overlap zone is not just a convenient label, it describes a real biological problem. Neanderthals and Denisovans were sister lineages, but they were not sealed off from one another. Their DNA crossed. In Denisova cave itself, one individual had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. That fact alone destroys the idea of perfectly bounded species living in isolation. Wherever their ranges met, mixture occurred. If northern India sat near one of those contact zones, then people there were not living at the edge of a species map. They were living inside a braided human landscape. A southern Denisovan group in central or peninsular India, a Neanderthal-related group along the northwest and Himalayan fringe, and expanding Homo sapiens groups entering from the west would have created exactly the kind of ancestry tangle that later DNA reveals. This also helps explain why the Neanderthal ancestry in people today feels both universal outside Africa and strangely detached from the classic European Neanderthal fossils. The DNA in living people is not simply a perfect copy of late Western Neanderthals from Europe. It points toward introgression from a related group that split earlier from some sequenced Neanderthals, likely somewhere farther east or south than the famous Ice Age caves of Europe. A Neanderthal-related people living across Western Asia, Iran, Central Asia and Northern India would fit that pattern far better than a single encounter with classic European Neanderthals. In that model, Neanderthal ancestry entered Homo sapiens in a broad Asian contact belt, not only in the Levant, and India sits near the eastern extension of that belt. Once that is accepted, the Narmada skull becomes part of a bigger question. What happened when Homo sapiens arrived in a subcontinent already inhabited by archaic humans? The answer was not instant erasure. It was contact over time. Some groups vanished, some were absorbed, some retreated into ecological pockets, some contributed DNA that later became hard to detect because later migrations diluted or rearranged the signal. The fossil evidence is sparse, but the geography demands complexity. The genetic inheritance in living people demands complexity. The skull from Narmada demands complexity. A simple march across empty India cannot explain any of it. There is also a deeper reason Narmada has been hard to classify. The categories themselves were built before Denisovans were known. For a long time, fossils were forced into an older framework: Homo erectus, archaic Homo sapiens, Homo heidelbergensis, Neanderthal, or modern human. Denisovans were invisible. Their fossil identity had not been named. So an Asian skull that looked archaic, large-brained and regionally distinctive was either dragged toward Homo erectus or pulled toward archaic Homo sapiens. But once Denisovans entered the picture, a third option opened. The strange Asian fossils were not necessarily late erectus leftovers or failed sapiens experiments. They were candidates for Denisovan diversity, especially in the south. Narmada's central Indian setting gives that idea unusual strength. If southern Denisovans ranged across Southeast Asia, they had to connect somehow to mainland Asia. India, Myanmar, southern China and mainland Southeast Asia formed a network of possible contact zones. During lower sea levels, island barriers changed, coastlines expanded, and the Sunda Shelf connected much of Southeast Asia into a vast landmass. Java was not an unreachable island in the same way it is today. Human groups could move through corridors now drowned beneath shallow seas. Ngandong's world was connected to a larger Asian stage, and Narmada sits along the western edge of that stage. At the same time, the northern Denisovan zone extended across Siberia and Central Asia, overlapping with Neanderthals in the Altai and perhaps farther west. This creates a north-south Denisovan division, with northern Denisovans tied to colder steppe and mountain environments, and southern Denisovans tied to tropical and subtropical Asia. Between them lay contact corridors through China, Tibet, the Himalayan margins, and Southeast Asia. India, sitting below the Himalayas and open to both western and eastern movement, becomes a critical missing piece. The Narmada skull is therefore not merely an Indian fossil. It is a test case for whether southern Denisovans reached deep into the subcontinent. The match with Ngandong is especially striking because it shifts attention away from Europe and Africa. Narmada belongs to Asia, and its most meaningful comparisons are Asian. The long, low cranial form, the heavy construction, the archaic vault, the impression of great robustness combined with substantial brain size, all place it in a world where the old labels start to blur. Ngandong has the same problem. It is too late and too advanced in some ways for a crude, primitive survivor label, yet too archaic for a neat modern assignment. These fossils look like branches of a regional Asian humanity that endured for hundreds of thousands of years, and Denisovan DNA gives that humanity a name. The implications reach directly into the ancestry of people today. Neanderthal DNA in all major non-African groups is not an accidental footnote. Denisovan DNA in Oceania and parts of Asia is not a curiosity. These signals are the surviving traces of contact zones that were once full of bodies, languages, families, territories, and conflicts. If northern India was within the Neanderthal-related range, and central or southern India lay within the Denisovan-related range, then the subcontinent was one of the few places where the ancestors of today's people could have encountered both archaic lineages across a connected landscape. That makes India central to the formation of Eurasian ancestry, not peripheral. This also challenges the habit of treating South Asia as genetically important only after modern humans arrived. The older inhabitants mattered. They shaped the terrain of contact. They created the conditions under which incoming groups mixed and adapted. A Homo sapiens group entering a land occupied by southern Denisovans would not simply replace them in a clean sweep. It would learn the terrain, take mates, exchange technologies, compete for river valleys, and carry fragments of local ancestry onward. A group passing through the northwest would encounter Neanderthal-related humans adapted to cooler, drier corridors. A group moving farther east would enter Denisovan-rich landscapes. This is how a broad ancestry mosaic forms. The Narmada skull therefore stands at the center of a profound reinterpretation. It tells us that India had a deep archaic human presence. It tells us that the fossil evidence from Asia cannot be explained only by African arrivals and European Neanderthals. It tells us that southern Denisovans need a body, and the best candidates are not in Siberia, but in the tropical and subtropical belt, where Denisovan ancestry is strongest today. It tells us that the mysterious solo skulls from Java and the Narmada skull from India belong in the same conversation. And it tells us that Neanderthal DNA in modern humans becomes easier to understand when Neanderthal-related people are allowed to extend across the northern gates of India. The old map was too clean. Europe had Neanderthals, Siberia had Denisovans, Africa had Homo sapiens, India was a route, Southeast Asia was a destination. But ancient humanity did not respect those lines. The real map was layered, shifting, and alive. The Neanderthal range pushed east. The Denisovan world spread north and south. Homo sapiens moved through lands already filled with other human lineages. India sat between them, receiving pressure from the west, the north, the east, and the south. In such a world, the Narmada skull is exactly the kind of fossil that should appear. Not a perfect representative of a textbook group, but a survivor from a borderland where the borders were biological, ecological, and constantly shifting. And that is why Narmada refuses to disappear. It is too important, too well placed, and too anatomically suggestive to be treated as an isolated fragment. It belongs to the unresolved center of Asian human evolution. It points toward a southern Denisovan world that was broader than Siberia, older than the late migration stories, and far more relevant to living ancestry than most people realize. It also points toward a Neanderthal frontier that reached farther into Asia than the older imagination allowed. Between those two worlds, in the river valleys and plains of India, the ancestry of later humans was not simply passing through, it was being changed. The skull from Narmada is not silent. It says that the deepest chapters of human history were written in overlap zones, not in isolated homelands. It says that India was not empty when later humans arrived. It says that the southern Denisovans were real, that their anatomy is hiding in plain sight among the great Asian fossils, and that Ngandong and Narmada belong to the same unresolved problem. It says that Neanderthal DNA in people today is less mysterious once the Neanderthal world is extended into the northern approaches of India. And it leaves us with a final, unsettling thought. The fossil that could help explain one of the greatest ancestry puzzles on Earth has been sitting for decades in the middle of the map, waiting for the map itself to change. Thanks for watching, and please like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment since you made it this far.